In the shadows of ancient basilicas and among the crumbling ruins of the once mighty Roman Empire, a new empire was forming, one of silk, incense, and power cloaked in divine robes. And at the center of this empire rose a boy, not a prophet nor a martyr, but a prince of privilege, crowned not by holiness but by bloodline. His name was Octavianus, the illegitimate son of the powerful Roman noble Alberic II of Spoleto. And at just 17 years old, he would become Pope John XII, one of the youngest and most scandalous successors to St. Peter. It was the year 955. Rome was not yet the seat of holiness we imagine today. It was a fragmented, corrupt city, crawling with the ambitions of feuding families, warlords, and clergy with swords under their cassocks. The papacy itself had become a prize, less about piety and more about politics. And Alberic, the so-called Prince of the Romans, intended to keep that prize in his family. On his deathbed, Alberic gathered the Roman nobles and clergy and extracted a chilling oath that when the current pope died, they would elect his teenage son Octavian as the next pope. There was no talk of merit nor divine calling, only lineage. And when Pope Agapetus II passed, the city obeyed. Octavian was crowned, taking the name John XII. But even as the sacred oil touched his brow, Rome whispered, "This is no shepherd. This is a boy with a crown." He was young, handsome, charismatic, and unprepared for the weight of the tiara. But John XII didn't hesitate. Almost immediately, he blurred the lines between the sacred and the profane. He refused to renounce his noble title, still calling himself Prince of the Romans, as if he were both emperor and pope. The Lateran Palace, once the sanctum of Christ's vicar on earth, became the playground of a teenager handed absolute power with no one to answer to. And so began a papacy not of sermons but of seduction, not of reform but of revelry. The boy pope had risen, not to save Rome but to indulge it. Long before John XII ascended to the throne of St. Peter, the eternal city was already cracking beneath the weight of its own contradictions. Rome, once the glorious heart of an empire, now stumbled through the 10th century as a faded relic, part battlefield, part shrine. Its marble temples stood beside crumbling tenements. Monks prayed in candlelit chapels while mercenaries brawled in the alleys outside. The grandeur of Caesar's Rome still whispered from the ruins, but the city itself had become something else entirely, a prize fought over by noble families, foreign kings, and ambitious clerics. The papacy had long since lost its moral high ground. In this age, often called the Saeculum Obscurum or the Dark Century, the papal throne was less a seat of spiritual leadership and more a pawn on a corrupt chessboard. The powerful Roman aristocracy, especially the Theophylact and Tusculan families, treated the Holy See like personal property. Popes were installed, deposed, and even murdered, often by those who claimed to defend the church. Piety was rare. Power ruled. Rome itself was fractured. The city's neighborhoods were ruled like fiefdoms, and street violence was a daily occurrence. Armed gangs served noble lords. Monasteries functioned as fortresses. Even the basilicas, those holy places of worship, often bore the scars of battle. Meanwhile, the citizens of Rome, caught between papal decrees and noble vendettas, learned to survive in a climate of fear and chaos. It was into this volatile landscape that Octavian, soon to be John XII, was born. His family, the Crescentii by blood, held immense sway. His father, Alberic II, ruled Rome like a king in all but name. He kept the papacy firmly under his thumb and maintained order through brute strength. But his death would loosen the last threads of restraint. By the time John XII donned the papal tiara, the moral authority of the church was already in question. The people had seen too much, too many popes with lovers, too many sacred vows broken, too much blood spilled on holy ground. Rome was not waiting to be saved. It was waiting to see just how much further it could fall. The Lateran Palace, Rome's oldest papal residence, was meant to be a place of prayer, humility, and divine governance. But under Pope John XII, it became something else entirely, a palace of sin, draped in crimson velvet and echoing with laughter that no saint would dare bless. It was no longer the sanctum of the shepherd, it had become a court of excess, and at its center sat a teenager who wore the robes of holiness like a costume at a masquerade. John XII quickly abandoned any illusion of restraint. Reports from the time, though often written by horrified enemies, paint a portrait too wild to dismiss. The young pope allegedly turned the Lateran into a brothel in all but name. Women, married or not, were brought in at all hours. Prostitutes were said to roam the halls freely, mingling with bishops and nobles. Rooms once reserved for sacred councils now hosted drunken feasts. Holy relics were sold to fund his pleasures. Sacred silence gave way to music, laughter, and the clinking of goblets deep into the night. The Pope did not feast alone. He surrounded himself with a cabal of lovers, flatterers, and criminals. He rewarded loyalty not with virtue but with indulgence. Land, titles, even church offices were handed out like party favors. He was accused of simony, bribery, and desecration. One chronicler, Lateran of Cremona, claimed that John toasted the devil and invoked pagan gods in jest. Whether every accusation was true or inflated by political foes, the truth was undeniable. Rome's spiritual leader had made the Vatican a stage for vice. Worse still, John XII treated sacred duties as inconveniences. He rarely celebrated Mass and neglected church administration altogether. Bishops complained that he refused to ordain them unless they paid him. Papal letters went unanswered. Monastic discipline crumbled. Pilgrims who came to Rome expecting to see the successor of St. Peter left shocked, whispering tales of drunken cardinals and scandalous banquets. But inside the palace, John seemed untouchable. He was young, charming, and backed by powerful families. The walls of the Lateran kept out judgment for a time, but not forever. For while the Pope reveled behind silk curtains, storm clouds were gathering beyond the Tiber. And soon those walls would no longer protect him. The Vatican was no longer holy. Under Pope John XII, it became a theater of indulgence where lust was law and reverence was ridiculed. What had once been the moral heart of Christendom now pulsed with scandal, as Rome's sacred crown became a teenage boy's toy, and the Holy See was transformed into something far darker than even the cynical Romans had expected. Pope John XII ruled like a prince in a decadent court. His papal apartments were rumored to be filled with mistresses and concubines, many of whom were nobility's daughters sent to negotiate with the pontiff. Married women entered and never returned the same. Nuns fled their convents only to be seen whispering through papal corridors. Some chroniclers claimed he even seduced his own relatives, though history offers only silence to confirm or deny such depravity. One thing is certain: the Lateran, once consecrated by centuries of Christian faith, now echoed with laughter, moans, and betrayal. He was not discreet. Banquets were hosted with musicians, dancers, and fountains of wine. Priests and bishops were invited to partake, not in spiritual communion but in fleshly abandon. Church offices were sold to the highest bidder, and John's lovers were known to influence appointments. The term nepotism took on new dimensions as even cardinalships were offered to friends and family, regardless of merit or morality. John XII's actions went beyond indulgence. They desecrated the institution. He openly mocked the sacraments. He was accused of drinking toasts in the name of pagan gods like Venus and Bacchus. Altars were defiled. One bishop reported that John made offerings to the devil for amusement. The line between myth and fact may blur here, but one thing was clear to contemporaries: the vicar of Christ had become the lord of corruption. And yet, the young pope remained defiant. To his court, he was not a scandal, but a legend in the making. To his friends, he offered gold and power. To his enemies, he wielded fear and silence. The papal court had become a den of lust and ambition, guarded by privilege and fueled by impunity. But lust cannot govern forever. And the world outside the Vatican was beginning to stir. There were whispers in the north of an emperor who had heard the rumors, and he was coming to Rome. While Pope John XII bathed in luxury behind the walls of the Lateran, outside those marble halls, the world was watching, and it was not impressed. To some, John was a scandal. To others, a threat. His debauchery had turned the Holy See into an open wound on Christendom. And when power is wielded without foresight, enemies multiply in silence. John XII lacked what every ruler must possess: political instinct. He was impulsive, rash, and dangerously overconfident. At a time when Europe was a mosaic of feuding kingdoms, tribes, and nobles, he treated diplomacy as a game and broke alliances as carelessly as he broke commandments. He had one powerful card to play: the imperial crown. The Holy Roman Empire, though still in its infancy, offered both protection and prestige. Seeking a stronger ally against the feuding Roman aristocracy and rival Italian warlords, John made a bold move. He invited Otto I, the German king, to come to Rome and be crowned emperor. In 962, Otto entered the Eternal City with pomp and solemnity. John placed the imperial crown on his head, forging a moment that should have reshaped Christendom. But almost immediately, John regretted it. The teenage pope didn't understand that Otto was not a passive ally. He expected reform, stability, and respect for the church's dignity. And when Otto witnessed the chaos in Rome, the bribes, the whores, the mockery, he was horrified. He urged John to reform. John predictably ignored him. Worse still, the Pope secretly opened negotiations with Otto's enemies, inviting Hungarian warlords and rebellious dukes to rise against the German king. When Otto found out, he did not respond with words. He returned to Rome with an army. John fled. Cowardly and humiliated, the Vicar of Christ vanished into the hills. In his absence, Otto summoned a synod, an emergency council of bishops, and laid bare the accusations: perjury, simony, murder, rape, even invoking demons. John XII was declared deposed. A new pope was appointed. But Rome, as ever, was a city of shifting loyalties. And while Otto returned north, John would return in vengeance, like a shadow in the night, ready to reclaim what he believed was his by divine right, no matter the blood it cost. The recklessness of youth was now the ruin of a papacy. In the cold stone halls of the Basilica of St. Peter, beneath flickering candlelight and the watchful eyes of painted saints, a gathering of bishops prepared to do the unthinkable, put the Pope himself on trial. The year was 963, and the man on the throne of St. Peter, Pope John XII, had vanished, fleeing the wrath of Emperor Otto I. What remained in Rome was scandal, chaos, and a church on the verge of collapse. The world had seen corrupt popes before, but none so brazen, none so young, none so dangerous. Otto, determined to cleanse the rot at the heart of Christendom, summoned a synod, a solemn council of bishops, priests, and nobles, to hear the charges against John XII. What followed was not a trial. It was an exorcism of power, where the sins of one boy would be aired for all the empire to witness. The list of accusations read like a satire of holiness. John was charged with simony, selling church offices for gold; with murder, having blinded a cardinal; with rape of pilgrims, widows, even nuns; with turning the papal palace into a brothel; with gambling with sacred relics; with toasting the devil and invoking Jupiter during prayers; with refusing to ordain bishops unless they bribed him with coin or bodies. Some of the bishops wept as the testimonies were read. Others sat in stunned silence. Even in a world hardened by war and corruption, the crimes of John XII stunned the conscience. He was not merely sinful, he was obscene. With the Pope in hiding and refusing to appear, the synod acted. They declared John deposed, citing both his crimes and his desertion of duty. In his place, they elected Leo VIII, a mild-mannered layman favored by Otto, who was hastily ordained and crowned. For a moment, it seemed the church had stood up for itself, that righteousness had found its voice again. But Rome is never still. While the church exhaled, John XII plotted. Far from defeated, he rallied mercenaries and loyal nobles. And when Otto left Rome to tend to the empire, the streets of the city trembled once more. The boy pope was coming home, and he would not return with forgiveness. The city of Rome, weary from its endless cycles of betrayal and blood, barely had time to adjust to its new pope when a chilling rumor began to spread: John XII was back. He returned not as a penitent but as a conqueror. With an army of loyal Roman nobles and mercenaries, the deposed pope stormed the city in early 964. Pope Leo VIII, hastily chosen and barely settled on the papal throne, fled for his life. The people, Some driven by loyalty, others by fear, welcomed John back with uneasy silence. He had tasted disgrace and now he wanted retribution. And he took it. John XII launched a vicious purge. Those who had dared support the synod against him, bishops, clerics, even laymen, were hunted down. Some were mutilated. Others excommunicated. The Church's fragile order crumbled once again under the weight of vengeance. The Vatican was drenched not in prayer but in suspicion. The Holy See had become a throne of terror. But John had not changed. The scandals resumed as if they had never stopped. He held feasts while bodies were being buried in the streets. He reinstated his lovers, repopulated his inner circle with old cronies, and ignored papal duties altogether. In less than a month it became clear, this was not a restoration of the Church. It was a revenge-fueled encore of decadence. And then, just as suddenly as he returned, Pope John XII died. The story of his death is as murky as his life was flamboyant. Some claimed he was struck down by the hand of God, suffering a stroke while in the act of adultery. Others whispered a more fitting end, that he was murdered by a jealous husband, catching the Pope in bed with his wife. Whatever the truth, John died at the age of 27, in the very same city he had bathed in scandal. No grand funeral was held. No solemn mourning observed. He was buried in the Lateran in silence, and within days the people had moved on, some with relief, others with lingering disgust. He had ruled for 8 years. He had worn the crown of Peter and defiled its meaning. And in the end he left behind not a legacy of faith, but a warning, a parable of how absolute power in the hands of the young and reckless can destroy even the holiest of institutions. His reign left the Church scarred, humiliated, and reeling from a crisis of identity. The Holy See, once revered as the moral compass of Christendom, had become a symbol of corruption, lust, and betrayal. Never before had the title of Vicar of Christ been worn so carelessly, so obscenely, and never again would it be so easily forgotten. The years that followed his death were marked by shameful reflection. Clergy and chroniclers alike struggled to reconcile how a teenager, barely formed in mind or faith, could have ascended to the papacy and turned it into a stage for vice. Some blamed the Roman nobility, whose iron grip on papal elections had reduced spiritual leadership to a family business. Others pointed to the Church's own weakness, its lack of checks and accountability. But most simply whispered his name, John XII, as a cautionary tale. Historians came to call this period the Saeculum Obscurum, the dark age of the papacy. It was not just a dark time for Rome, but for the soul of Catholicism itself. When popes are chosen not by merit or prayer, but by politics and inheritance, the result can be disaster. John XII proved that a man could wear the papal tiara and still behave worse than any pagan emperor. Yet from this darkness, the seeds of reform began to take root. Shocked by the moral collapse, future church leaders would push for stricter guidelines around papal elections. Monasteries would rise as centers of reform and resistance. And centuries later, movements like the Gregorian reforms would look back at John XII's reign, not with anger but with resolve. Even so, his legacy is one that the Vatican does not celebrate. No frescoes of him adorn church walls. No hymns sing his name. In lists of popes, he is but a cold number, his story tucked beneath centuries of more righteous successors. But the memory lingers, because John XII reminds us of something uncomfortable, that even the holiest of institutions can fall. That power, when unearned and unchecked, corrupts absolutely. And that the greatest scandals in history are not always born from heresy or invasion, but from within. In the end, Rome endured. The Church endured. But the shadow of the teenage pope who turned it into a brothel has never fully lifted.